Alright, I'm going to show you how to use Unreal Engine's PCG system to procedurally create towns, cities, and villages. One of the graphs will spawn buildings along a spline road, while the other will create a town within the interior of a closed loop spline. First, create a spline blueprint. What I have here is just a basic spline mesh blueprint that will spawn a road mesh every 800 units. A bit messy, but straightforward to understand. Create a variable to store the size of the road mesh, feed it through some F to get the location and tangents along the spline, and then set up the logic to spawn the mesh every 800 units. Now on to the actual PCG graph. Let me disable everything so you can see how it is built from the ground up. Alright, let's start with the street lamps. First, set up a spline sampler with a distance set to 3,200 units. That would be 32 meters. Use a bounds modifier to better reflect the size of the mesh. Plug it into a projection node to lower the mesh down to the size or height of the terrain. Use two transform nodes to move a copy to each side of the road and rotate them to properly face the interior. Then create a difference node to make sure no points spawn on the actual road itself. The data we'll be plugging into the difference node will come from a spline sampler with a bounds mod to define the road that we're using. Then finally spawn the street lamps themselves. Next up are the stones along the side of the road. Set a distance of 34 along the spline, and do the same as the street lamps. Transform a copy to both sides, rotate them, and self-prune. From here, add on a density noise and a difference node. Into the difference node, we'll be plugging in the same road points we created earlier for the street lamps. From here, we'll be splitting off the points using a total of 4 density filters. You can get away with using less if your stones are similar in size. Mine, on the other hand, requires some transform points nodes to offset them and getting more even look. Now onto the houses. Use a spline sampler and adjust the bounds to better fit the size of your houses. Transform a set of points to each side and project the points using landscape height. Up next, we'll be using a combination of self-pruning nodes and difference nodes to prevent any overlapping buildings when crossing roads. Next, add a density noise to both the left and right side and adjust the seeds. This is to ensure the buildings don't perfectly mirror one another across each sides of the road. From here we'll be splitting off the points using 3 density filters. These 3 filters will be used to adjust further for the 3 general sizes we'll be using for our houses, which we'll do using a couple transform nodes and some bound modifiers. From here we'll be using difference nodes to remove any points spawning directly on our road, and self-pruning nodes to make sure identical houses don't spawn right next to each other. From here you can spawn your houses using a spawn mesh node or a spawn actor node. I'll be using a spawn actor node to spawn instance level meshes. This is useful if you're using modular assets instead of single whole mesh buildings. Make sure to merge your points before sending them off to the next step. This is essential to prevent any unexpected behavior. Some PCG nodes will require your points to be merged in order to function as intended. Alright, create a point grid with a cell size of 200 and an extent of 1000. Plug this into a copy points node. This will create a grid of points around each building point. From there, use a transform for randomness. Then a distance node and a filter to take out any points intersecting with the houses. After that, add a self-pruning to prevent any overlapping points. Then a second distance and filter, this time for the road. I ended up creating a second set of road points here. You only need one, I'm just too lazy to reroute things. Next part will begin with a distance node using our newly created points as the source and our house points as the targets. Use a projection node to make sure everything is fully grounded. Self-prune one more time, then split into 3 different density filters. These density filters will use the previously created distance node to determine which points become which objects, according to their distance from the house. For the first part, we'll use a density noise and a density filter to cut down on the amount of points we'll end up using. Transform node to randomize the size of the objects. Then finally, the static mesh spawner. This is the one we'll use to spawn crates, barrels, bushes, and other random objects. For the second row, we'll be adjusting the bounds to account for larger objects. Then a difference node to make sure they don't overlap with any of our other existing points, such as the first row, the third row, and our houses. And then from here, use the same nodes as the previous row: density noise, density filter, and the transform points. End it with a static mesh spawner and spawn some trees. And I'll repeat that one more time, and this time we'll be using it to spawn wheelbarrows, carriages, and other such objects. Now on to the greenery, which will be essentially just another rinse and repeat of the previously created points. with another point grid, modify the bounds, and then copy points to the targets. Distance and filter out points away from the road. Project the points down onto the landscape. And we'll be using a difference node to block away points from our existing points. And we'll be using more distance and difference nodes to cut away other points. Then we'll be using a density noise to split off our points into 3 branches. This first row will spawn small bits of grass. The second row will spawn larger weeds and bushes, using a distance and filter node to push them further back away from the road. And then we'll be doing the same thing again, this time for the pine trees. And that is it for the first graph. Now we'll disable everything and start from the very beginning. A spline sampler, a bounds mod, and transform points. Use the bounds mod to increase the size of your points. Then the transform node to shuffle your points around. Once you're done with that, project your points onto the landscape. Then add a distance node. For the target, we'll be using a second spline sampler, which will sample the border of the spline. Use a density filter to cut out any points too close to the border, and then a self-pruning node to cut out any overlapping points. From there, add a density noise. We'll be using the density noise to split off into 3 branches using 3 density filters. These 3 density filter branches will be the same as our previous graph, using each one to represent a different general size of our houses. Up next, we'll create 2 sets of the same grid. We'll plug each one into their own distance node. One of them will be using a box bound, the other one will be using a sphere bounds. Next, we'll create a distance node to cut away any points that land on our border. Then next we'll add a density noise. And from here we'll spawn our stone pathways. The stones I'm using here are the same stones I used on the road. They don't look quite right here, but they serve their purpose as placeholders. After that, we'll use our second set of points to spawn our random town objects, in pretty much the same way as we did in our previous graph. You can go ahead and just copy and paste the whole thing, only making some finer adjustments for our distance. Up next, we'll plant some grass using another 2 sets of point grids. Project the points to the landscape projection node. Then we'll add a self-pruning node, and then difference and distance nodes to block away our points from any other existing points. And then from there we'll add a density noise and density filter to control the total amount of grass we'll use. And then from there one more difference node, this time connected to our stone pathways. And then the last part of our graph will be the trees on the border. Take our previous spline sampler, plug this into a bonds modifier, and then a transform points to scatter the points. Project the points onto the landscape and self-prune. Following that, add a density noise and split this off into 2 density filters. On the first row we'll spawn the bushes, and on the second row we'll spawn the trees using a difference node to cut away from any houses. And that is the graph. From here you can make any adjustments as needed, move around the splines, or change it to however you like. As you can see here, you can grab the end of a road spline, extend it out, and instantly spawns more town. You can move over here to our neighborhood, move around the roads, regenerate, and everything's adjusted. Now, before I end the video, I have uploaded the PCG graphs to Gumroad, so if you feel like supporting a broke developer, you can download the project files there. Assets you see here are not included, they are not mine, but assets I've gotten from Unreal's monthly giveaways and Humble Bundles. Instead, the graphs will look like this, with large cubes representing houses and some Unreal Engine default meshes scattered as trees and rocks. Better looking rocks than the ones I had anyway. And if you're interested, I'll be making another video soon, this one for forest environments.